Good day. If you've ever studied the Psalms, you'll have noticed some common themes of repentance, of praise, of deliverance. Deliverance from one's enemies is a common theme of the Psalms. So I did a little experiment this morning. I started reading through to see how long would it take before that theme pops up. Turns out Psalm 3 was all it took. Quote, "Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, are a shield around me. My glory, my one who lifts my head high." When I used to read the Psalms, I would come across these themes of deliverance from enemies, and I would think, it doesn't really apply to me. I don't have any enemies. I mean, I have problems, conflicts with people, but enemies? No. But as I started to grow in public life and in my career take some stands based on principle, the enemies came. They are real. I am currently the head of the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And it deals with a series of controversial issues, from discrimination on the basis of race, sex, national origin, and color, to questions as to the beginning and end of life, assisted suicide, abortion, identity based on sex, gender identity, same-sex orientations. These issues touch some of the most controversial veins in American public life. I have the privilege and honor to enforce our civil rights on these contested questions. But because I've taken principled stands, I have received hate mail, political cartoons, questioning of my background, my qualifications. And these attacks came, again, because of taking principled stands on issues of the day. We are currently in a time of deep national division. And the topic of my talk today is how we could bridge those divisions, yet be faithful to the principles that you stand for. You can do both. You can not only live an integrated principled life, but do it so effectively. And I started out with the Psalms about deliverance from enemies. And I'll take it through to the New Testament, where Christ spoke not only of loving one's neighbor, anybody could do that, but of loving one's enemies, which is one of the distinctive claims of Christianity itself. And what does that really mean other than wishing the very best for your opponents and meaning it? I've tried to put that principle into action in my life. So as I arrived as the head of the Office for Civil Rights, there was a lot of suspicion. The media was certainly not friendly upon my arrival. That political cartoon I mentioned actually had me in a hoodie pouring gasoline all over the office, suggesting I was going to burn down the place. Even though I had dedicated my life to civil rights, from religious liberty when I was at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, to 7 years as a trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, the premier civil rights organization in the world. But I was entering an environment of suspicion, and one of the first things I did was pay a personal visit to every single staff member. We were spread out across 10 regional offices and a headquarters, and from day one, I would visit personally with each person so that they get to meet me, understand me, but more important than that, for me to understand where they were coming from. It took over 46 hours of these personal visits to make those connections, to hear people's stories. And it paid off massive dividends coming by. Because what I realized was that even though we may have disagreements about policy, what people really care about is how it's going to impact them personally. So my goal was to say, I care about your personal development. And one of the big things I started off with was a reinvigoration of the protection of conscience and religious liberty, rights that had been ignored in the civil rights space for far too long. And again, there was disagreement as to how far these rights should go. And one of the first things I did was to tell my staffers that if you disagree with the direction we're going on these policies, you don't have to take part. I respect people's conscience. We will find something for you that will make you happy and excited to come to work every single day. Civil rights is for everybody. And the direction is still going towards the cause of justice. Even though the direction might be slightly different than what somebody would expect or prefer, we're all rowing in the same direction. So I made that clear to people, that I respect your conscience. And it had a wonderful effect where people were actually benefiting from protection of conscience and were able to understand what I was trying to do by establishing a new conscience and religious freedom division within the Office for Civil Rights. But the first step had to be listening and understanding and building those connections. Fairly early in my tenure, our country was riven by conflict. You remember the Charlottesville protests. You remember the young woman who was killed and run over by a car. This was a moment of deep national tragedy and controversy. As my position as head of a civil rights office, people were looking to me to say, what was I going to say? When my statement came forward, not everybody agreed with it. It was a message of unity, not of condemnation. One of my staffers wrote a very, shall we say, pointed email to all of our other managers, criticizing what I had done for not going far enough. My staffers looked at me, wondering what I was going to do in response. So I called her in, sat her down, and instead of reading her the Riot Act, I said, you're speaking from a place of pain and hurt. I want to listen and understand. And she was disarmed. That was not what she expected. And my other managers saw that reaction, where I responded instead with magnanimity instead of harshness. And we built that relationship for understanding. This again happened after the George Floyd killing. Again, people were looking to me to see what I was going to say. There, I most certainly condemned the unjust killing of a person by police. And then, of course, the wounds were reopened. We had a listening session for over 2 hours where everybody told their stories of their interactions with the police, both good and bad. Because again, what was playing out on national television is playing out in every human heart. It's that struggle of doing what's right, of having proper calibration of your reactions when you see injustice, having tolerance and mutual respect. And it began from listening and hearing people's pain and their stories. Moving on from listening, to be able to bridge these differences. There are differences that must be acknowledged. But once you have that level of understanding and respect, you can actually begin a dialogue. So you should give reasons for your beliefs. Open yourself up and be vulnerable. It's not an easy thing to do when it speaks to controversial topics. But if you are a person of integrity, stand for what you believe in and explain. As I mentioned, my office deals with many controversial subjects, one of which was dealing with the question of human sexuality, human identity, and the interaction with that and our civil rights laws. In the previous administration, there was a movement to define sex as being male, female, neither, or a combination of male or female. We took a stand in our regulatory rulemaking to say that with respect to HHS, with respect to our scientific work and medical work, the biological basis of sex as male and female, as biological realities, makes a difference, and that should be reflected in our laws. These are controversial topics, to be sure. I spent 2 hours discussing these topics with my staffers in an open session and took all questions until they were all exhausted, explaining why we were doing what we were doing, listening to the counter arguments, providing responses, and doing this to show respect. There was disagreement, and that disagreement was brought out to the open. I would much rather people who disagree with me hear the reasons for what we're doing, as opposed to harbor that in their heart quietly, or only speaking in soft tones for fear of some sort of retaliation. Because when disagreement is buried, it doesn't go away. It often just builds, and when the pressure builds, it could blow up. And nobody wins when you have that circumstance. So when I did these listening sessions, when I did the exchanges, when I justified in explicit, transparent terms what we were doing, it was a manner of showing people respect. The goal wasn't the goal wasn't to simply convince others. Hopefully some would be persuaded to a degree they weren't before, but to at least show respect. And I did this when I started with my first outside listening session as well. Not only were my staff needed to be taken care of, shown respect, but opponents on the outside. My very first listening session was with pro-choice groups and LGBT groups, where we had this same sort of honest, deep exchange, where I was open to criticism. I had to open myself up and be vulnerable. And from that meeting, I struck up a relationship with the head of impact litigation for the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, which were clearly on the opposite side of the issues from the direction I was taking the office. After that meeting, we struck up a conversation. We were both Hispanic. We both had common ground. And from that started a true, genuine relationship of mutual affection. Whenever we visit each other's hometowns, we see each other, share meals, spend time with family. With that, we've built bridges and connections. This also was expanded to the Williams Institute. My immediate predecessor, Jocelyn Samuels, was the head of that organization, which is a leading LGBT think tank in America. One of the first things I did was ask Jocelyn for advice. She was in the seat that I was in before me. She cared about the Office for Civil Rights at HHS. So I wanted her wisdom and her advice. How did she do it? How to make the tradition continue? And she was gracious enough to share her experiences. And from that, we also struck up a relationship. And she invited me to speak at a Williams Institute event in DC, an auditorium full of people who disagreed with me. And the very first words I said were, I'm not here to convince you. I'm here to show you that I respect you. And you could visibly see people who were at first tense and suspicious start to relax and warm up and see me on a human level as I was seeing them. But it takes reaching out to try to make that human connection. But more than all, it takes true sincerity. Sincerity also means humility. Humility is realizing who you are, both the good and the bad, accurately. That means standing up for what you truly believe when it's proper, and also saying when you could do better. The three hardest words in the English language are, I am sorry. I am sorry is so hard to say because pride gets in the way, but it opens up so many doors if you're willing to take that step when it is appropriate. Some of my staffers had worked hard on the questions of Section 1557, gender identity, language access, again, these controversial issues of the previous administration. And we were headed in a very different direction. And I was criticized during my tenure early on for not being transparent enough, for not telegraphing, this is where we're going, come along and at least see. And people were insulted that there was such a big change in direction on certain issues without the proper preparatory work. People felt disrespected. And when we had a public meeting of all my staffers, over 200 people, one of the staffers had the courage to call me out and say, you, Director Severino, say that you're about openness and bringing people along, but you didn't tell us until we learned in the media that there were these changes going on some major policies in our office. And I took that in, and I said, I'm doing my best, and I apologized. More than that, after the meeting, I personally met with each individual who had worked on that issue to apologize in person. And to a person, they said, you don't have to apologize to me. I said, no, I think I do. And from that, it again established that connection. In fact, the person who had the courage and boldness to criticize me publicly in turn became one of the hardest workers for some of our new initiatives. She's a star now among our team that enforces our conscience and religious freedom rights. And nobody would have guessed from that, some would call confrontation, that it would end up leading to such a fruitful outcome. And it began by her standing up and speaking with integrity, and me being able to say that I was sorry. I've seen this practice bear fruit in other areas as well. We work a lot on disability rights. We work a lot on pro-life issues. The common theme in both is a protection of human dignity, no matter their stage of life, no matter their condition, no matter their ability or their disability. And on this score, I see common ground between people who see themselves as pro-choice and pro-life, especially on the question of disabilities. Again, through our listening sessions, I made a connection with a gentleman from the ACLU who saw that my pro-life views were centered on human dignity and had deep overlap with disability rights. So again, we struck up conversations and we worked hard to find common ground, work on common projects together, particularly when it came to COVID-19. When COVID-19 hit and the threat of potential rationing of ventilators came to the fore, there was a very real question as to who would be left behind if there were a shortage. In fact, some state policies said that people with intellectual disabilities would not be entitled to ventilators if there were ever a shortage. People with deep intellectual disabilities would be left behind and thrown overboard. This was a utilitarian ethic that was counter to our foundational principles of respect of human life and human dignity. This is the exact same principle that the disability rights community and the pro-life community can both stand behind. And we are able to bridge this common ground with otherwise odd bedfellows. And we're turning opponents into allies and even friends working for the common good. Working together with these two now allies protecting human dignity, we had 5 states reach resolutions in changing their policies to respect human life regardless of their abilities, to make sure we don't cast people aside. Enemies can be turned into friends if we're willing to show our love of enemies. Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg, our late great justices, who were on extreme opposites when it came to the issues of interpreting our Constitution. Yet they were the best of friends through their common ground of a love of opera. Even though they would joust with each other in court and in their writings, they never lost that bond of common humanity. It was still one Supreme Court for one United States. In this time of deep division, I want to present that message to you, that there is a way for us to come together while being principled and true to truth and justice. Thank you.